The smell of diesel and damp upholstery clung to the crowded city bus as the morning sun flashed through streaked windows. I gripped the metal pole, my knuckles white, trying to steady myself, while my stepfather's voice thundered behind me. Harold Donovan had been simmering since we left the house, his face red from whiskey breath, though it was barely past 8. He didn't care that we were surrounded by strangers. His hand shot out fingers like iron around my arm, yanking me so hard my shoulder screamed. Gasps rippled through the aisle. A man in a baseball cap lowered his newspaper. A teenage girl froze mid-scroll on her phone. Then, Harold's fist came down, slamming into my ribs with a force that knocked the air from my lungs. Pain exploded across my side. The bus jolted to a stop, and I collapsed against the seat back, coughing my vision swimming. Someone muttered, "Oh my God," but no one moved. My mother, Margaret Donovan, perched primly 2 seats away, smoothed her skirt, and leaned toward me with a sharp whisper. "Lower your voice, Claire. You're embarrassing us." Her words cut deeper than Harold's fists. Blood pooled in my mouth, copper sharp, but the betrayal burned worse. My own mother's eyes weren't full of fear for me. They were full of disdain, as if my suffering was a spectacle she needed to hush. The passengers stared, trapped between horror and cowardice. My chest heaved, each breath slicing through pain, and I tried to cry out again. Harold's shadow loomed his broad frame, blocking the light, his knuckles clenched, daring me to resist. A man by the window raised his phone halfway, then faltered when Harold barked, "Put that down." The phone slipped back into a pocket, and silence reclaimed the bus. It felt like the walls of the vehicle were closing in a metal coffin filled with witnesses who would rather suffocate than speak. I reached for the seat handle, trying to pull myself up, but Harold shoved me down again, spittle flying as he hissed. "You think you're too good for this family, huh? You think you can shame us in front of everyone?" My ribs screamed, the world tilted, and still my mother's voice was a dagger in my ear. "Stop it, Claire. Sit still. Don't make a scene." I realized then that Harold's fists could break my body, but Margaret's words could erase me entirely. My voice trembled raw as I whispered back, "He's hurting me." She shook her head, lips tight, eyes darting at the passengers. "Keep quiet," she repeated, like silence was salvation. Around us, the bus rumbled back into motion, carrying dozens of silent witnesses who turned their faces toward the windows, pretending not to see. I felt invisible even as pain roared through me, trapped in a cage of apathy and shame. At that moment, I believed I might disappear completely. The bus rattled forward, every bump sending a fresh wave of fire through my side. My stepfather's hand pressed against my shoulder, pinning me like a predator holding down prey. I wanted to scream, but the humiliation strangled me as much as his grip. My mother's words still echoed ricocheting inside my skull. "Lower your voice." Passengers shifted in their seats, unease spreading like static. I could see it in their eyes, the instinct to intervene, but every gaze slid away the moment Harold's glare swept across the aisle. He was a man who thrived on fear, and strangers, sensing his rage, shrank into silence. The betrayal was not just Margaret's whisper, it was the entire bus folding into cowardice. A woman clutched her handbag tighter. The teenage girl put her earbuds back in, a man coughed, and stared out the window as though the violence beside him belonged to another world. The air smelled of exhaust and shame. My breath came ragged, half from pain, half from the suffocating knowledge that no one would save me. My stepfather leaned closer, his lips curled into something between a snarl and a smirk. "See, Claire, nobody cares. Nobody ever will." His voice was low, but sharp enough for me alone. I flinched, not from the threat of another blow, but from the truth nestled inside it. For years he had whispered poison, and my mother had nodded along. I looked at her now, her manicured hands folded tightly on her lap, her eyes fixed ahead like she was riding with strangers, not her bleeding daughter. She didn't flinch when Harold struck me. She flinched only at the sound of my voice. My throat tightened as realization spread like ice through my chest. Her silence wasn't weakness. It was choice. The bus screeched to another stop, doors hissing open. For a moment, I prayed someone would step in, that a voice would cut through the fog of apathy. Instead, more passengers boarded, eyes skimming the scene with wary calculation before they slid past, unwilling to involve themselves. One man hesitated by the steps, frowned, then retreated to the back, sinking into a seat as though distance could erase what he'd seen. My stomach turned. This was not just a private betrayal, it was a public one. The world had seen me bruised and silenced and collectively decided I was not worth the risk. Harold shifted beside me, satisfied his breathing, heavy and triumphant, while Margaret finally broke her frozen posture to dab her lipstick with a tissue. Her reflection in the smudged glass, more urgent than her daughter, crumpled at her side. "Compose yourself," she hissed when she caught me watching her. "People are staring." I wanted to laugh, to scream, to rip the bus apart with the sound of my rage. But my voice trembled and the shame pressed it back down my throat. I sank into the cracked vinyl seat, my ribs aching, my palms slick with sweat. The betrayal pressed heavier than Harold's blows. My own mother had looked at my suffering and seen only an inconvenience. She would rather I bled in silence than admit to the world that her perfect image had cracks. As the bus rumbled toward downtown, I realized I was trapped in more than a moving box of steel. I was trapped in their narrative, one where my pain was irrelevant, where my silence was demanded, where my existence was measured against their comfort. And in that suffocating silence, as Harold smirked and Margaret powdered her face, I knew something inside me was beginning to shift. I wish I could tell you that morning on the bus was the first time Harold raised his hand against me, but that would be a lie. It wasn't sudden. Violence never is. It starts like a stain that spreads slowly until it swallows the whole fabric. My memories are stitched with bruises, slammed doors, and the constant echo of my mother's voice telling me not to exaggerate. I was 10 when Harold first moved into our house. He carried his duffel bag and a cheap bottle of bourbon, and with it he carried a storm. The first time he yelled, the windows rattled. The first time he hit the table with his fist, the plates jumped like frightened birds. By the time he actually hit me, the silence in our house had already taught me it was coming. I remember one night the smell of fried onions lingering in the kitchen when he grabbed my homework and threw it into the trash. "Stop wasting time," he barked. "Nobody pays bills with poems." I had written an essay about my father, the man who died when I was 6. Harold sneered and tore it in half. My mother stood at the sink washing dishes, water running louder than my sobs. She didn't tell him to stop. She told me later, "Don't provoke him, Claire. He's under pressure." Under pressure. That became the refrain of my childhood. Every bruise, every scream muffled into a pillow. Every chair tipped over in a rage. All of it explained away by stress work money. I learned quickly that in our house, Harold's temper was the weather, and Margaret's silence was the law. I was 15 when he first slapped me. We were in the living room, the television buzzing with static because the cable had been cut off. He asked where my babysitting money was. I told him I had used it to buy books for school. His hand cracked across my cheek, sharp enough to send me stumbling. My mother's gasp was sharp too, but not for me. "Harold," she said softly, almost lovingly, not in front of the neighbors. Her eyes flicked to the window. She wasn't horrified that he hit me. She was horrified someone might see. After that, the line was gone. Slaps became shoves. Shoves became punches. By the time I was 17, I had mastered the art of excuses. Long sleeves in summer. Makeup thick enough to mask purple skin. Lies that rolled off my tongue like rehearsed lines. I fell. I tripped. I bumped into a door. My teachers never pressed too hard, and my friends learned to stop asking. The worst betrayal wasn't Harold's violence. It was my mother's devotion to keeping up appearances. Every time she told me to hush or stop making drama, she was choosing him over me. She was choosing the facade of a respectable marriage over the reality of her daughter's pain. And I believed her. That was the cruelest part. She convinced me that maybe I was overreacting, that maybe I deserved it. Gaslighting doesn't come with a warning label. It seeps into your bones until you can't trust your own bruises. When I went to college, I thought I was finally free. But Margaret and Harold had other plans. They visited often, usually with bills in hand reminding me of everything they had sacrificed to keep me afloat. Sacrifice in their language meant control. They co-signed loans in my name without telling me dipped into my bank account with excuses about emergencies. By the time I graduated, my credit was a wreck I hadn't even built. I tried to confront my mother once. I remember the way her lipstick glistened under the kitchen light as she looked me dead in the eyes and said, "Claire family helps each other. Don't be so selfish." Selfish. That word became another bruise. By my 20s, Harold didn't need to hit me as often. He didn't have to. The damage was already done, etched into my reflexes, my flinches, my silence. But he still did whenever money was involved, whenever control slipped through his fingers. And Margaret always found a way to excuse it. He didn't mean it. You know how he gets. Don't embarrass us. That's the phrase that carried through the years like a curse. Don't embarrass us. Not don't hurt her. Not don't do this. Don't embarrass us. And so when Harold struck me on that bus in front of strangers and Margaret hissed the same words again, "Lower your voice, Claire. You're embarrassing us." It wasn't a new betrayal. It was the same old wound torn open in public daylight. It was the culmination of years where my pain was an inconvenience, my voice a threat, my existence something to manage instead of cherish. Sitting there clutching my ribs as the bus lurched forward, I understood with brutal clarity this wasn't just about Harold's fists. It was about Margaret's silence. Her silence had raised me, shaped me, taught me that my suffering was less important than her pride. And if something didn't change, that silence was going to bury me alive. The morning of the bus assault wasn't random. Harold and Margaret had dragged me out of my apartment under the pretense of a family meeting, but I knew from the tightness in my mother's smile that it wasn't about reconciliation. It was about money. It always was. They insisted we take the city bus instead of Harold's battered truck. Cheaper, Margaret said, adjusting her pearl necklace like we were still in the suburbs and not in the crumbling apartment district where they now lived. But I knew the truth. They wanted me cornered without an easy escape. Halfway through the ride, Harold shoved a folder onto my lap. The edges were bent, stained with coffee, but inside were crisp loan documents. A line with my name typed neatly above the word, "Guarantor." "You'll sign this when we get downtown," he growled. 20,000. Just enough to clear a few things up. My stomach dropped. 20,000 wasn't a few things. It was a disaster dressed up as a quick fix. I pushed the folder back at him. "No, I'm not doing this again." His jaw twitched, a muscle jumping near his temple. Margaret's hand landed on my arm nails, sharp against my skin. "Claire, don't be dramatic. It's just paperwork. Families help each other." The words were coated in sugar, but her eyes glinted with steel. I thought of the last time I had discovered a credit card bill in my name, a debt I never agreed to. I had paid for their lies before watching my credit score sink like a stone, my future poisoned by their greed. "No," I repeated louder this time. Heads turned from the rows around us. Harold's breath stank of bourbon as he leaned close. "You think you're better than us? You think because you got your little degree you don't owe this family." His words slithered against my ear, but my heart pounded too hard to absorb them. I knew what came next. Violence was always his punctuation. I pulled back, clutching the pole, but Margaret hissed, "Lower your voice." People are staring. It was the same refrain, the same incantation she used to bind me into silence. But this time, the stakes weren't just pride. They wanted to chain me financially again, to trap me so deep in their debts I'd never crawl free. When I refused, Harold's fist met my ribs. That was the explosion everyone on the bus witnessed, but it wasn't the beginning of the fight. The fight had started the moment I said no to their demands. As pain radiated through my chest, I clung to that word no, like a lifeline. For the first time, I had denied them in public where the world could see, and that made Harold's rage even more dangerous. His fist wasn't just punishment. It was desperation. Desperation to crush my defiance, to remind me that I was property, not a person. Margaret's whisper twisted like a knife. "Don't embarrass us." She didn't care that I couldn't breathe, that my body ached from impact. She cared only that the illusion of a respectable family remain intact. I realized then that their demand for money wasn't just about debt. It was about control. If I signed those papers, I'd be bound to them forever. If I didn't, Harold would beat me into silence and Margaret would shame me into compliance. Either way, they thought they had me. But even through the haze of pain, I felt something shift. For the first time in years, I understood that saying no was dangerous, but it was also my only path to freedom. The bus lurched again, and I clutched the cold metal pole with one hand, the other pressed against my ribs. My vision blurred, spots of light darting across the corners of my eyes. Harold's weight loomed, his breath sour with bourbon, and my mother's words hissed sharp in my ear. "Lower your voice." I felt like the world had agreed to erase me. But then, I heard it, a man's voice, cutting through the suffocating silence. "Hey, that's enough." It wasn't loud, but it was steady, a tone that didn't waver in the face of Harold's rage. Heads turned. Passengers who had been hiding behind their newspapers and screens lifted their eyes. Harold stiffened his grip, loosening just enough for me to gasp a breath. The man stood halfway down the aisle, tall, broad-shouldered, his gray jacket worn but neat, his eyes locked on Harold's like steel. And then I recognized him. My uncle, Thomas Reed. I hadn't seen him in nearly 15 years. The last memory I had was of him arguing with Margaret in our driveway, his voice raised as he accused her of letting Harold ruin me. She had screamed back that he was overstepping, that he had no right. And just like that, he vanished from my life. Until now. My chest tightened with disbelief. What were the odds he'd be here on this bus at this exact moment? Harold sneered, squaring his shoulders. "This is none of your business." Thomas didn't flinch. "She's my niece. That makes it my business." The words landed like thunder. For a moment, the entire bus shifted, the cowardice cracked. A murmur rippled through the passengers, courage flickering in their eyes now that someone had stepped forward. Harold tried to laugh, but it came out brittle. "You don't know what she's done. She's ungrateful. She's bleeding." Thomas snapped his voice like a whip. "That's all I need to know." My mother's face drained of color. "Thomas," she whispered, clutching her purse as though it could shield her. "Don't start this again. Don't embarrass us." That word again, embarrass. It was always her shield, her weapon, her obsession. But Thomas wasn't having it. He stepped closer, his presence towering, his eyes never leaving Harold's. "You lay another hand on her, and I'll make sure every cop in this city knows exactly what kind of man you are." For the first time, Harold faltered. His fist hovered in the air, but didn't land. His bravado cracked under Thomas's unyielding stare. The bus driver's voice came over the intercom, shaky but firm. "Sir, if this continues, I'm calling the police at the next stop." Suddenly, Harold's rage had an audience he couldn't control, and with Thomas standing between us, his power slipped. My ribs still ached, my head still spun, but a spark of something I hadn't felt in years flickered inside me. Safety. It wasn't complete, not yet, but it was a crack in the darkness. Thomas turned to me, his face softening. "Claire," he said my name steady and real on his lips. "Come sit with me." My legs trembled as I rose, every muscle screaming, but I forced myself to move. Harold's hand twitched like he wanted to grab me again, but Thomas stepped between us, solid and immovable. The bus exhaled around us. The teenage girl pulled out her phone again, but this time she hit record. The man with the newspaper muttered, "Good," under his breath. The silence was broken. And though I was still shaking, still bleeding, I knew this moment was different. Harold hadn't won. Not this time. The bus stopped at the next terminal, and the hiss of the doors opening felt like oxygen rushing into a suffocating room. The driver had already called in a disturbance, and 2 transit officers boarded their radios, crackling. Harold's face tightened, a mask of irritation that barely covered his fear. Margaret stood, her purse clutched like a shield, whispering to him furiously. "Don't say anything. Just let me handle it." Thomas guided me gently down the aisle, his hand steady on my arm, careful not to press too close to my ribs. I could feel every set of eyes on me. For once, the stares weren't filled with indifference, they were witnesses. And witnesses meant evidence. The officers separated us quickly. One of them, Officer Daniels, asked for my name. His pen poised over a small notepad. "Claire Donovan." I whispered the words, tasting like ash. My voice shook, but Thomas stood beside me steady as a wall. "She was assaulted," he said firmly. "I saw it. Others did too." The teenage girl with her phone stepped forward, holding it out. "I recorded it," she said, her voice trembling but brave. My heart nearly collapsed in gratitude. For years, it had always been my word against Harold's, my bruises against Margaret's lies. But now, on a shaky phone screen, the truth was alive and undeniable. The officers took her phone, logging the video as evidence. Another man spoke up, gray hair, glasses, voice clear. "I saw him hit her. Twice." One by one, the passengers who had tried to disappear behind screens and windows began to speak. Their words weren't loud, but they stacked together like bricks, forming a wall I could finally lean on. Harold barked something about family business, about me being unstable, but his words cracked against the weight of witnesses. Margaret's eyes darted wildly, searching for an escape. At the station, they split us further. I was taken to a small room, sterile and bright, where a female officer asked me to recount everything. My ribs screamed as I breathed through the story, my voice hoarse but relentless. I told her about the loan papers, about Harold's threats, about Margaret's silence. Thomas sat beside me, his presence enough to keep me from collapsing. He produced a folder of his own papers he had kept for years. Bank statements, letters, notes he had collected after my father's death. Evidence of inconsistencies in Margaret's finances. I tried to bring this up before he admitted shame flickering in his eyes. But she cut me off. I didn't know how bad it had gotten. Looking at those documents, I realized Harold and Margaret's greed wasn't new. It had been there all along, woven into every demand, every time they told me I owed them. My student loans co-signed without permission, the credit cards that appeared in my name, the emergencies that drained my savings. Each piece was another chain they had fastened around me. Now Thomas was helping to snap them one by one. The hospital came next. X-rays confirmed 2 cracked ribs and deep bruising along my abdomen. The antiseptic sting on my cuts made me flinch, but I forced myself to stay still as the nurse documented every injury. Photographs, medical records, all sealed with timestamps, evidence. This time, I wouldn't walk away with just pain. I would walk away with proof. Thomas contacted an attorney, Denise Ward, a woman with sharp eyes and a sharper voice. She met me at the hospital, her legal pad already filled with notes. "We're filing charges," she said without hesitation. "Assault, coercion, financial fraud, if we can prove those loan documents. You don't need to protect them anymore, Claire." The words hit me harder than Harold's fists. "You don't need to protect them anymore." For years, silence had been my inheritance. Now my voice could finally count. Denise outlined the strategy. We'd collect witness statements from every passenger willing to testify. We'd secure the video recording. We'd pull financial records tracing the fraudulent debts back to Margaret and Harold. And we'd put everything in front of a judge who couldn't be swayed by image or excuses. My chest tightened, not just from broken ribs, but from a flicker of something dangerously close to hope. Margaret tried to call me that night. 27 missed calls stacked on my phone screen like a neon sign of desperation. Each voicemail was a variation of the same theme. "Claire, don't do this. He didn't mean it. You'll ruin us. Families don't take each other to court." But I didn't delete them. I saved every single one. Because now I understood her voice, her pleas, her gaslighting. They weren't just manipulations. They were evidence, too. For the first time in my life, I wasn't alone with the truth. The truth was written in medical charts captured on shaky cell phone footage, echoed in the words of strangers held in the files Thomas had saved, sharpened into legal arguments by Denise. The truth had form, weight, and teeth. As I lay in the hospital bed that night, bruised but breathing, I replayed the bus ride over and over. Harold's fist, Margaret's whisper, the silence of the crowd. But this time, when the scene reached its breaking point, I saw the moment Thomas stood up, the moment someone said, "That's enough." And I realized maybe that was the turning point. Maybe that was the day the silence finally began to break. The courthouse smelled like polish and nerves. My ribs were still wrapped tight under my blouse, every breath a reminder of the violence that had brought me here. But this time, I wasn't walking in alone. Thomas walked beside me, steady, carrying a folder so thick it looked like a weapon. Denise, my attorney, clicked across the marble floor in sharp heels, her voice low but confident as she briefed me one last time. Stay calm. Don't let them bait you. The evidence will speak louder than any of us. Inside the courtroom was smaller than I expected, but it carried the weight of judgment in every corner. Harold sat at the defense table, his jaw tight, his suit borrowed and ill-fitting. Margaret sat beside him, pearls around her neck, the same pearls she had worn the day she told me not to embarrass her. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for sympathy, but the jury looked at her with flat stares. The judge entered robes, sweeping gavel-striking wood. "This court is now in session." The sound cracked through me, sharp and final. The prosecution wasted no time. They called the first witness, the teenage girl from the bus. She clutched her phone in both hands, nervous but determined. "I saw him hit her," she said, her voice shaking but strong enough to carry. I recorded it. The screen lit up, and there it was. Harold's fist slamming into me, Margaret's whisper slicing through the chaos. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Harold tried to shift to sneer, but the image on the screen made his denial crumble before it left his lips. Next came the older man with glasses. His testimony was steady professional. He hit her twice. Everyone saw it. Each word was a nail in Harold's coffin. Then came the officers who had boarded the bus. They confirmed the scene, the statements, the evidence collected. And finally, the doctor who had treated me. He held up x-rays showing my cracked ribs, photographs of my bruises. Each image was projected onto the screen, stark and undeniable. Margaret shifted in her seat, fingers digging into her purse straps. I could almost hear her rehearsing excuses in her mind, but Denise wasn't going to let her slip free. "Mrs. Donovan," Denise said when Margaret was called to the stand, "you told your daughter to lower her voice while her stepfather assaulted her." "Why?" Margaret's lips tightened. "She was exaggerating. She always does. I didn't want her to make a scene." A scene. Denise's eyebrow arched. "Your daughter was being beaten in public and you were worried about appearances." Margaret stammered, her voice wobbling. "You don't understand. Harold was under stress." "Objection," Harold's lawyer snapped, but the judge overruled it. Denise pressed on her voice, sharp as glass. "Mrs. Donovan, are you aware that in addition to standing silent while your husband beat your daughter, you also participated in identity theft? We have bank records showing accounts in Claire Donovan's name opened without her knowledge with your signature on file." The room gasped. Margaret's face blanched, her painted composure cracking. "That's not true," she whispered, but the documents Denise laid on the table said otherwise. Thomas leaned forward, his voice carrying from the gallery when he was called to testify. "I tried to warn her years ago," he said, eyes fixed on Margaret. "But she shut me out. I kept the records. I knew someday the truth would need to come out." The jury scribbled notes. The judge's expression darkened. Harold's bravado melted into a scowl of desperation. Margaret's shoulders curled inward, smaller and smaller with each piece of evidence presented. Finally, it was my turn. Denise guided me to the stand, her hand briefly squeezing mine. I sat down the oath heavy on my tongue. When I spoke, my voice didn't tremble. Not this time. "I've spent my life being told to stay quiet." I began, my eyes locking on Margaret. Every bruise was brushed aside. Every scream was silenced. I was told not to embarrass the family, not to make Harold angry, not to expect anyone to protect me. But silence doesn't protect anyone. Silence is what nearly killed me. The courtroom was still. The jury leaned in. Even the judge seemed to soften. I described the years of abuse, the financial manipulation, the constant gaslighting. I recounted the bus ride in detail, the folder of loan documents, Harold's fists, Margaret's whisper. And then I said the words that had carried me through every sleepless night since I will never lower my voice again. Denise's closing argument tied everything into a razor's edge. The defense will say this is a family matter, but it is not. This is violence. This is fraud. This is betrayal. Evidence never blinks. The bruises, the bank records, the video, the witnesses, they all tell the same story. Claire Donovan was not protected by the people who should have loved her most. Today, this court has the power to correct that. The gavel struck when the verdict was read. Guilty. Harold Donovan, assault, coercion, attempted fraud, 5 years in state prison. Margaret Donovan, identity theft, financial fraud, willful neglect, 18 months under house arrest, community service, and a restitution order to repay what she had stolen. As the bailiff led Harold away, his eyes burned with impotent rage. Margaret slumped in her chair, pearl necklace trembling against her skin. For the first time, I didn't feel small under her gaze. I felt free. Thomas squeezed my shoulder. Denise smiled brief but fierce. And as I stepped out of the courthouse into the bright sunlight, I breathed deeply despite the ache in my ribs. The air tasted like justice. The courthouse steps were blinding in the midday sun. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, but their noise was muffled by the thunder in my chest. Justice had been served, yet walking into freedom felt unfamiliar, like trying to breathe through lungs that had only ever known smoke. Harold was gone, sentenced. Margaret was tethered to her punishment, but their fingerprints were still all over my life, buried in bank accounts, debts, and the shadowed corners of my past. That night, Denise sat across from me at Thomas's kitchen table. The wood was scarred from years of use, but it felt like the safest place I had sat in a long time. She spread papers across the surface, financial statements, credit reports, notarized letters. "This is the next battle," she said, her tone both stern and kind. The physical abuse was obvious. The financial abuse is harder to untangle, but we can do it. I stared at the numbers lines of debt that didn't belong to me yet, carried my name. A credit card with charges for luxury clothes Margaret wore, vacations I never took. A loan Harold had siphoned into a business that never existed. Each account was a parasite draining my future. Denise tapped one page. "The fraud verdict against your mother gives us leverage. We'll petition to have these debts erased, flagged as fraudulent. It will take months, maybe longer, but once cleared, you'll be free of their financial grip." Thomas leaned back, his arms crossed. "I'll cover the legal fees," he said, his voice gruff but resolute. "You don't owe me a cent. This is me finally showing up when I should have a long time ago." My throat tightened. Gratitude sat heavy in my chest, almost unbearable. The following weeks were a blur of signatures, notarizations, and tense phone calls with creditors. Some were skeptical, others cooperative once they saw the court documents. Every time I held up a fraud report, I felt a little more of Harold and Margaret's power dissolving. Piece by piece, I was reclaiming my name. One afternoon, a letter arrived from the mortgage company. The house I had grown up in, the one Margaret had nearly leveraged into foreclosure, was no longer tied to her. The court had voided her authority over it. Tears blurred the words on the page. That house wasn't just wood and brick. It was the only piece of my father left untouched by Harold's fists or Margaret's silence. I visited it a week later. The paint peeled, the porch sagged, but it still smelled faintly of cedar and childhood. Standing there, I felt my ribs ache, as if reminding me what it had cost to get here. But for the first time, I wasn't just remembering pain. I was imagining possibility. The house was mine now, untainted, unchained. Margaret tried again to reach me. Letters this time written in her curling script. They were drenched in apology but soured by excuses. I only did what I thought was best. I was scared too. We are still family. I read them once, then placed them in a folder marked Evidence, because I had learned even apologies can become weapons if you're not careful. Meanwhile, Harold's sentencing reverberated beyond the prison walls. His old drinking buddies, scattered neighbors, whispered colleagues cut ties. For once, his reputation couldn't shield him. Margaret's punishment kept her confined, and the community service hours stripped away the polished image she had always tried to maintain. People finally saw her not as a victimized wife, but as a participant, a woman who had chosen silence and greed over her own daughter. At night, I sat with Thomas on the porch of his home. Fireflies blinked in the dark, cicadas hummed, and for the first time, the air wasn't heavy. "You know," he said quietly, "freedom doesn't happen all at once. It comes in pieces. But every piece you've claimed, you've earned it." I looked at the thick folder Denise had left with me, legal victories, cleared debts, property titles, and realized he was right. Freedom was paperwork and pain signatures and scars, but it was also this moment-breathing air that belonged to me alone. The entanglements weren't gone entirely. There would still be creditors to fight debts, to erase shadows, to chase away. But each document stamped, each account closed, was a chain broken. And with every break, I felt lighter. By the end of that month, I had something I hadn't had in years, a bank account in my own name, untouched by fraud. A house deed that bore only my signature, a future that no longer had Harold or Margaret's hands clawing at it. For the first time, I wasn't just surviving their betrayal. I was building beyond it. Justice in the courtroom didn't end the war, it only shifted the battlefield. Within days of the verdict, whispers started to reach me. Margaret had wasted no time weaponizing her punishment into a performance. She told neighbors she was framed, told old church friends I was ungrateful, told anyone who would listen that her fragile daughter had betrayed her own family. One morning, Thomas slid his phone across the table. On the screen was a Facebook post Margaret had written. "Some children will do anything for attention, even destroy their parents. Harold is not perfect, but prison." Claire exaggerated. "Pray for us." Hundreds of comments sprawled beneath it, half pitying her, half suspicious. My stomach knotted as I scrolled through strangers debating my life like it was gossip over coffee. The smear campaign didn't stop online. At the grocery store, a woman who had known Margaret for years whispered to her cart partner loud enough for me to hear, "That's the girl who turned her parents in." I walked past them with my chin up, but inside I burned. They hadn't been on that bus. They hadn't heard my ribs crack. Denise warned me this would happen. When abusers lose control in court, they try to reclaim it in public opinion, she explained. It's another form of manipulation. Don't engage. The truth is on record and the record doesn't lie. Still, the barrage stung. Margaret sent letters to family relatives painting herself as the victim of a vindictive daughter. My cousins stopped calling. An aunt wrote me once, "I don't know what to believe anymore. Margaret says you've always been dramatic." That word dramatic echoed like a bruise inside my chest. It was the same script I had heard my whole life, but this time I wasn't alone in answering it. Thomas stood taller than I'd ever seen him correcting neighbors bluntly. "You didn't see what I saw he'd say. You didn't read the court transcripts. She nearly died." Denise reminded me that silence was strategy now, that every time Margaret smeared me, she only undermined her own credibility if I stayed quiet. Evidence never blinks. It wasn't easy. Nights stretched long, my phone lighting up with notifications I forced myself not to open. But slowly, I noticed a shift. Some people who had once defended Margaret began to fall silent. The teenage girl's bus video went viral on a local news site, replayed again and again. Her voice trembling but firm, I recorded it. That video did what Margaret's gossip never could. It showed the unfiltered truth. Soon, the narrative began to turn. Articles focused less on Margaret's pity posts and more on the courage it had taken to testify against my own family. Advocacy groups reached out offering platforms to speak. Survivors messaged me privately. "Thank you for not staying silent. Your story is mine too." The smear campaign had intended to isolate me, but instead it exposed Margaret further. Each bitter post revealed her obsession with appearances. Each whisper in the grocery aisle was a reminder that she cared more about reputation than redemption. And in the cracks of her performance, people saw the truth. The final straw came when Margaret tried to spin her house arrest into martyrdom. She posted photos of herself cleaning trash on the side of the road in her fluorescent vest, captioned, "Even punished, I serve my community." Unlike some daughters, but instead of sympathy, the comments turned brutal. "You stole from her. We saw the video. Stop lying." For the first time, the tide rolled against her. I didn't need to clap back. I didn't need to write rebuttals. I had already spoken in the only place that mattered, the courtroom. My truth was sealed in evidence in bruises and records. Margaret's lies were only echoes against a wall of facts. One night, sitting on the porch of my reclaimed childhood home, I finally allowed myself a deep breath. The cicadas buzzed the night air cool against my skin. The smear campaign had been loud, messy, humiliating, but it had also proven something. No matter how hard she twisted the story, she couldn't erase what had been seen recorded and judged. For the first time in my life, the silence that had once suffocated me now worked in my favor. By refusing to respond, I let the truth stand taller than her noise. And the truth finally was enough. In the weeks that followed, I felt like I was waking up in a body that finally belonged to me. The bruises on my ribs faded, but the deeper scars, the ones carved by years of silence and manipulation, would take longer to heal. Yet for the first time, healing wasn't just survival. It was reclamation. I started with the simplest thing, my name. For years, it had been twisted on documents I never signed, scrawled in debts I never owed, smeared in gossip. Margaret spread like wildfire. One afternoon, I walked into the bank with Denise at my side and closed the last fraudulent account tied to me. When the teller stamped the paper, closed, I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. That one word meant my identity was mine again, no longer shackled to their greed. Next came my home. Standing in the front yard of the Donovan house, the place where I had grown up, cried, hidden bruises, whispered dreams I thought would never come true. I held the deed in my hand. My father's name was there, and beneath it, mine. No Harold, no Margaret, just us. I touched the chipped paint of the porch railing and whispered, "We're back, Dad." Tears burned but didn't fall. They weren't tears of grief anymore. They were proof of survival. Thomas helped me restore the place. Some weekends we scraped wallpaper, other weekends we rebuilt the sagging porch steps. Every nail hammered in was a declaration this house no longer belonged to ghosts. It belonged to me. Meanwhile, Denise encouraged me to speak publicly. At first, I resisted. I was still raw, still reeling from the smear campaign. But one evening, an email arrived from the teenage girl who had filmed the bus attack. She wrote, "I almost deleted that video because I was scared. But when you stood in court and told the truth, you gave me courage. I know now that silence protects no one." Her words hit harder than any insult Margaret had hurled at me. Silence protects no one. That was the lesson carved into my bones, so I agreed to attend a local survivors group. Sitting in a circle of women, each with stories that mirrored mine in terrifying ways, I felt less alone. I told them about the bus, about Margaret's whisper, about the courtroom where I finally refused to lower my voice. When I finished, the room was quiet. Then one woman reached for my hand. "You've given us a voice too," she said. That was the turning point. Soon I was asked to speak at community events, then at a regional conference on domestic abuse. Each time I stepped to the podium, my ribs twinged faintly, a reminder of where I'd come from. But my voice didn't shake anymore. I told them evidence never blinks. Silence may feel safe, but it feeds the abuser. The only way out is through, and I promise on the other side there is light. Margaret's smear campaign had tried to strip me of identity, paint me as unstable, dramatic, ungrateful. But now, standing in front of strangers who clapped not out of pity but respect, I realized she had failed. She no longer defined me. The empowerment came in small, unexpected ways, too. The first time I laughed freely, bent over in Thomas's kitchen while we burned a batch of pancakes. The first time I signed a check with only my name, no strings attached. The first time I slept through the night without jolting awake to phantom footsteps in the hall. Piece by piece, I rebuilt not just my finances, not just my home, but myself. The self that Harold's fists and Margaret's whispers had tried to erase. The self that had always been there waiting for the chance to rise. One evening, standing on the porch of the restored Donovan house, the cicadas humming the stars sharp above, I whispered to the air, "I will never lower my voice again." This time, the words didn't feel like rebellion. They felt like truth. They felt like freedom. The house became more than just shelter. It became a headquarters for rebuilding not only my life, but the lives of others. The survivor support group I had spoken to kept asking me to come back. Each time, new faces appeared, women with fading bruises, men with hollow eyes, teenagers clutching notebooks where they scribbled feelings they couldn't yet say aloud. I realized something: my story wasn't unique. That was the most heartbreaking part. My story was everywhere, hidden behind closed doors, muffled by whispers like Margaret's, "Don't embarrass us." That's when the idea for Quiet Strength was born. It started small, a circle in my living room, coffee mugs steaming on the table, folding chairs borrowed from Thomas's garage. We didn't have resources beyond our voices and a box of tissues, but it was enough. People came and they kept coming. Word spread through shelters, through counselors, even through a few kind officers who knew what it meant to believe survivors. Soon I realized it couldn't just be a living room effort. Denise connected me with a nonprofit attorney who walked me through the paperwork. Within months, Quiet Strength became official. Donations trickled in, then poured many from strangers who had seen the bus video or read about the trial. Survivors began calling not just for meetings, but for housing help, legal advice, emergency support. I hired staff people who had survived themselves. Their stories were stitched into the walls of the organization, proof that pain could be transformed into power. We created a hotline, then a scholarship fund, then partnered with local businesses to offer safe jobs. Each step felt surreal. Margaret once told me silence was survival. I had built an entire movement proving her wrong. At our first anniversary gathering, I stood on a stage in a community hall packed with folding chairs. Nearly 100 people filled the room clapping as I took the microphone. My ribs still ached faintly on cold mornings, but that night I stood tall. Behind me hung a banner with our name, Quiet Strength. This started in my living room, I told them. It started with bruises, with silence, with whispers that told me to lower my voice. But tonight proves something: we are louder than silence. We are stronger than fear. The crowd rose, applause, thundering. Among them, I saw the teenage girl with her phone, the one whose video had cracked my cage open. She waved her smile wide. Without her courage, I might not have been standing there at all. Even recognition found me. A year after Harold's sentencing, the mayor's office honored me with a Community Leadership Award. I stood under the glare of Chandelier's plaque in hand, and for a moment thought of Margaret and her pearls clinging to appearances. She had chosen silence to protect her image. I had chosen truth, and it built something lasting. But the real reward wasn't plaques or applause. It was the late-night call from a woman whispering, "I saw your story. Because of you, I left." It was the teenager who told me, "I want to volunteer. I don't want anyone else to go through what you did." The legacy I was building wasn't about me alone. It was about proving that evidence and voice could topple even the tallest walls of silence. It was about teaching others what I had learned on that bus, that the moment you refuse to lower your voice, you begin to reclaim your life. Thomas often sat at the back during our meetings, a quiet sentinel. After one gathering, he pulled me aside, his eyes misty. "Your father would be proud," he said simply. For the first time in years, I believed it. Quiet Strength was no longer just an organization. It was a promise that every survivor who walked through our doors would leave knowing their voice mattered. That silence was not survival. That healing was possible. And as I stood under the banner surrounded by people whose lives were beginning again, I knew this was my true inheritance. Not Margaret's lies, not Harold's debts. Strength, quiet at first but unstoppable. 2 years after that bus ride, I walked out onto the porch of my childhood home at dusk. The cicadas sang in the trees, the sky blushed purple over the horizon, and for the first time in my life, silence felt like peace instead of punishment. My ribs had healed. My finances had been cleared. Quiet Strength was thriving. But more than anything, I had reclaimed something I once thought lost forever myself. Looking back, I saw the arc of it all. Margaret's whisper. Harold's fists, the courtroom where I finally spoke without trembling. Every betrayal had carved scars, but every scar told a story of survival. And now, those scars no longer marked me as broken. They marked me as someone who refused to be erased. My phone buzzed with a message from the Quiet Strength hotline. A new caller. Someone else ready to take that first terrifying step into the light. I texted a volunteer to answer, and as I slid the phone back into my pocket, I felt a deep certainty. This cycle could be broken. It was being broken one voice at a time. Margaret would likely never admit the truth. Even under house arrest, she clung to her illusions, posting filtered photos and half-truths. Harold was serving his time, still trying to convince anyone who'd listen that he'd been provoked. But their grip on me was gone. Their legacy of silence ended with me. Instead, I built my own legacy. Every meeting at Quiet Strength, every survivor who walked out straighter than they walked, and every letter from someone who said, "Because of you." I spoke. That was the legacy I chose. That was the family I created, the one built not by blood, but by courage. Sometimes people ask if I forgave Margaret. My answer is simple: forgiveness is not required for freedom. I don't need her apology to validate my truth. My justice came not from her remorse, but from my refusal to stay silent. I know many who hear my story wonder, what if it had been me? What if my own family betrayed me like that? Would I have had the strength to stand up? And my answer is yes, you would. Because strength doesn't roar at first. It whispers. It says no on a bus seat. It insists on medical records. It files petitions. It picks up a hammer to fix a porch. It builds piece by piece until one day you look back and realize the life that was stolen is finally yours again. As I watched the sun sink behind the trees, I whispered the words that had carried me through every courtroom, every late-night panic, every moment I wanted to cave back into silence. I will never lower my voice again. Not for appearances, not for shame, not for family who chose betrayal over love. If you are listening to this, if you've ever been told to stay quiet, to keep the peace, to put family reputation above your own survival, I want you to hear me clearly. Your voice matters. Your evidence matters. And you deserve to be heard. I was once just a woman with broken ribs and a lifetime of silence. Now I am a woman with a movement, a home reclaimed, and a life rebuilt on truth. If I could climb out of that darkness, you can too. The only way out is through, and on the other side, I promise there is light.